In the last 3 to 4 years, internet governance, foreign policy, and national security issues have started to intersect in interesting ways. Now, one essential piece of background here is that because the internet is a relatively new system, there was no established international regime for the internet. It didn't evolve out of the telecommunications or media communication regimes. The internet was an emergent phenomenon, and it took states by surprise. Key aspects of its governance are in the hands not of international treaty organizations, but what I like to call the organically developed internet institutions, such as the Internet Engineering Task Force, the Internet Society, the regional internet registries, and this strange hybrid ICANN. In 1996, the Clinton administration took a dramatically innovative turn with internet governance, promulgating what it called the Framework for Global Electronic Commerce, which said that we want the internet to be private sector led. We do not want it to come under intergovernmental treaties. We do not want it to come under the United Nations or the ITU. We now call these organically developed internet institutions the multi-stakeholder model. The US approach, of course, was intended to keep governments out, with one important exception, and that would be the US government itself. The US government maintained control of ICANN via a special contract known as the IANA Functions Contract. This contradiction between a non-governmental internet governance and a unilaterally governmental ICANN started getting controversial in 2003 to 2005 during the World Summit on the Information Society. But the issue was really unresolved, and we had a long debate about this and increasing hostility, which showed up in the International Telecommunication World Conference on International Telecommunications in 2012. We literally had a kind of a bipolar world in which 85 or 89 states voted for a new treaty in telecommunications, and 55 of them did not because they were fighting over internet governance. Well, whatever you think of Edward Snowden, the NSA revelations have helped to unwind this deadlock. The NSA revelations sent ripples through the current system of internet governance for a number of reasons. And this, of course, is true despite the fact that everyone recognizes there's no relationship between NSA surveillance and these organically developed internet institutions. But what it did was, it kind of discredited US claims for a special status of stewardship, and it reinforced the accusations of people who are already claiming that the US should not have this special role. But more importantly, perhaps, it imposed severe economic costs, or at least raised the threat of severe economic costs on US companies. Not only did it undermine trust in the US government, but it undermined trust in US companies who are now viewed, fairly or unfairly, as tools or intermediaries for the NSA. And so we got the Montevideo Statement, which the Internet Society played a role in, calling for the globalization of ICANN and IANA. And by the way, my research center recently has released a paper describing a plan for the globalization of IANA. We also got a unique alliance between ICANN and the Brazilian government, and plans for a meeting on internet governance called the Global Multi-Stakeholder Meeting on the Future of Internet Governance, or GUMFIG, if you like acronyms. Of course, ICANN and the other organically developed internet institutions are not the only aspects of internet governance. It's a very broad area. For example, ISP interconnection arrangements, and people on the previous panel brought up some of the issues about the degree to which ISPs should be held responsible for the so-called hygiene of the internet. Some people consider net neutrality to be an internet governance issue. It certainly is a globally debated issue now. security production and new forms of network governance among the security community done outside of government is an interesting phenomenon. And of course, privacy, data protection, and surveillance issues are part of the mix. ICANN gets most of the attention because it is a single centralized global institution, a place where people can actually point to something that does internet governance, but there's a lot of different forms of internet governance going on, most of it somewhat decentralized, and many of us consider this to be a good thing. So, to open up our panel today, I'm going to turn to Paul Brigner, who is the Regional Bureau Director of the Internet Society, and he's going to tell us about multi-stakeholderism.
Certainly. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning. It's always great to be back at Georgetown, my alma mater for my law and business degrees. So spent a lot of time here, and I'm very thankful and honored to be a part of this conference and to be able to speak with you. So I am a representative from one of the organically developed internet institutions that Professor Mueller mentioned, the Internet Society. We are a global nonprofit organization that works to promote the open development, evolution, and use of the internet for the benefit of all those in the world. And we also play kind of a unique role in the internet ecosystem, and that we are the home, the organizational home, as it's referred to, as the Internet Engineering Task Force. So we have our roots back to the founders of the internet, and we have very strong beliefs in open standards for technical policies and also for the multi-stakeholder model. We believe that the multi-stakeholder model is central to internet governance. It is something that has developed organically, somewhat differently from other models of governance. So it's been somewhat hard for a lot of people to define. And now I think that it has come to a head where people are focusing on the topic so closely that we do need to put more definitions and more terms around it so people can understand it better. So the internet technical community has been working recently to develop a contribution to the GOMFIG. That's the Global Multi-Stakeholder Meeting on Future of Internet Governance coming up in Brazil. And there's 7 principles that the internet community has developed. This is a document that has just begun circulating to some of the members of the internet technical community, so I cannot say that it is fully adopted, but I suspect that many will sign on and that it will be proposed at the multi-stakeholder meeting in Brazil. So there's 7 principles that we believe are central to the multi-stakeholder model, and that is that it must be open and inclusive for participation. This is something that has been a key characteristic of the Internet Technology Standards process through the Internet Engineering Task Force, and it is also important through internet governance. We believe it should be consensus-based. For those of you familiar with the Internet Engineering Task Force, you'll know that the RFCs there, that's the documents prepared as internet standards, are based on rough consensus, and consensus-based is a key principle that they are promoting. Permissionless innovation. This is the ability to start up a business, to go on the internet and start something new and develop something without asking for permission from any central authority. And we believe that that is critical. We certainly believe that there should not be additional central authorities developed to manage the internet and internet governance. So maintaining that spirit of permissionless innovation is key. Collective stewardship and empowerment. So here we believe that the internet governance structures and principles must be developed in an environment of strong cooperation among all stakeholders, and each contributing a perspective informed by their respective roles and responsibilities. And just a couple more that are pretty clear. Transparency, that these principles and the internet governance should be developed in an environment of transparency, and it should be pragmatic and developed in an evidence-based approach. And finally, through voluntary adoption. So many of these principles that I've just outlined are very similar to what principles are held close by the Internet Engineering Technical Community through the IETF. So going further, aside from the meeting in Brazil upcoming, there's another set of very important meetings that are part of Internet governance that are referred to as the Internet Governance Forum meetings. So the 9th meeting of the Internet Governance Forum is going to be held in Istanbul this year in September. And recently, that group called for public input on how the Internet Governance Forum could evolve. So there's, again, a document that's been created and submitted for this process. And again, we are pulling from the experience of the Internet Engineering Task Force, pulling a couple of those principles that are key and could be used to actually help the Internet Governance Forum address one of its main criticisms, which has been that it has not developed strong policy outcomes. So we believe that the Internet Governance Forum can develop and propose policy outcomes through 3 steps. Create a new category of meetings through the IGF. At the Internet Engineering Task Force, they have what's called birds of feather meetings, where small groups of experts get together and develop solutions for specific areas of technology problems. The same could happen for the policy area through birds of feather type sessions. We believe there could be best practice forums, and these could have main slots on the IGF agenda. So focusing on those areas that have been proven to be good solutions and develop best practices for internet governance. And finally, the key to the IETF work is to have intersessional progress and to ensure that there's work in between the meetings that they have. So we believe that IGF could leverage that type of approach as well to have substantive intersessional work. So I think that is the close of my introductory remarks. And clearly, we want to support the multi-stakeholder model. We believe it's key, and we think that leveraging our experiences through the IETF and other forums that have been key to the internet ecosystem will be a way forward in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Our next speaker is Mr. Takashi Kume, who is with the Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. So he's actually the only governmental representative on this panel. Mr. Kume.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Professor Mueller. I'm really honored and grateful to be a part of this great discussion with the distinguished panelists by the kind invitation of Georgetown University. I was introduced as a government official, but let me qualify that remarks here today will be within my personal responsibility and accountability, which is not connected to the institution which I belong. And because this issue is so challenging, and I want to be as much as flexible and creative. And my current task at JETRO and my previous experiences at METI involve trade, economy, and industry, which require me to contemplate how to utilize the potential that the internet could provide to the extent maximum. When I was a visiting researcher at Georgetown Law Center from 1999 to 2000, I was engaged in the study of international trade law. And I found it interesting that someone said that the internet is somewhat like a trade pact as an invention. As you all know, the internet is a network of networks, and it has grown at incredible speed over the past decades because the bigger it got, the more it made sense for other networks to connect to it. Just as free trade agreement between countries increased the market and gained from trade, so the internet led to greater gain from the exchange of data and allowed innovation to flourish. So let's begin with my question, which is, what is the real new problem of internet governance? As Professor Mueller kindly articulated this issue, mainly from political landscape, but I can't help asking this question myself, because I was engaged in internet-related issues around 2000, 2007, mainly from a security perspective. This kind of issue, such as who should control or govern the internet, was seriously discussed as well. So my question is, what is a genuinely new challenge that has recently emerged? There are some countries that have concerns about security. Putting aside what security means exactly, there would be many ways, for example, for a government to prohibit their people from having access to certain website which the government doesn't like. I went to the Middle East, Iran, and Turkey 2 weeks ago. In Tehran, I found that the internet access was extremely slow and so unsuccessful, although Wi-Fi was equipped at the hotel. You are very likely to be blocked to get access even to an ordinary Japanese website. VPN was legally prohibited, but you cannot help finding a way to use it. And I suspect there seems to be a conventional wisdom for Iranian people or how to do that. What is interesting is President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif have their own account of Twitter and Facebook and send a message quite often, although Iranian people are prohibited from using them. So anyway, even from a government point of view that wants to constrain free access to a certain kind of information, technically speaking, they can basically do that regardless of how the internet is governed. I'd rather think internet governance would be better viewed as an everlasting challenge, since internet governance involves the politics over the value that the internet could and should provide to the world. So my hypothesis is that some countries or people might not like the value itself that the internet could provide, and they want to change that. In order to make that argument very simple, let's suppose there are two basic values, both of which are based upon free flow of information. One is democracy and human rights. The other is innovation. We might have been assuming that these two types of values couldn't be separated, but some people or countries might want to have only a part of them, which is innovation, maybe. So democracy or human rights are no thank you to them, at least at this moment. So the question here is how to deal with this choice of value issue. Let me give you another example. When I was in Turkey, the headline of newspaper there was about the newly proposed regulation on the internet. Turkey is about to introduce a new set of regulations which enables the government to block web pages for privacy reasons without first having to obtain a court order. The opposition says the measure is intended to stop the continuing leak of material on the internet from corruption, investigation into government-connected figures. The EU, US, and the Council of Europe have all expressed concern. The reason why I picked up these two countries is just because I visited there recently. They are not the only case, of course, but this is the reality, I think, how the balkanization of the internet is growing as opposed to the huge potential it could have accelerated to realize free flow of information by which democracy and innovation will flourish. So let's get back to the original question again. What is the new challenge to the internet governance? It seems like loss of trust is a keyword. So next question is who have lost trust in whom? Actually, Professor Mura have already pointed out, but I have been trying to find any evidence in Japan to show that Japanese people have lost trust in the internet after a series of reports concerning Snowden and NSA. I have found nothing so far. I have asked my Japanese friends and colleagues the same question, but the answer is the same, no. Therefore, I need to find a reason for that, because if you read any newspaper or magazine here and there, it was just taken for granted that people got lost the trust. So I would like to provide 3 hypothetical reasons why Japanese people don't seem to get lost the trust. Hypothetical reason number 1, because Prime Minister Abe or other high-profile people have not been reported yet that he or her conversation over the mobile phone was wiretapped by NSA or other government agencies. So if that kind of information was once revealed, the situation might change. Hypothetical reason number 2 is because Japan has more serious problems than trust issues, such as cyber attacks from abroad. People are too busy reacting to these immediate threats and problems. But I suspect this kind of situation may not be so much different from other countries. Therefore, I need to find more persuasive reasons. Hypothetical reason number 3 is lost trust is basically against the US government, and Japanese people have not lost trust in the US government. This sounds like more plausible. Not only Japan is a close ally with the US, but also Japanese public sentiment of the US is, by and large, very good. According to the most recent public opinion survey done by the Cabinet Office, 82% of Japanese people have a favorable view of the US, whereas 80% of Americans have a favorable view of Japan, according to the Gallup survey released on February 20th this year. So my assumption is that what is told in the context of loss of trust really means loss of trust of the US government, which is more likely to become a loss of trust in US companies recently. So the degree to which someone can trust the US might be a proxy for the extent to which someone can trust the internet governance as it is. So getting back to the Turkish case, one of the ministers of the Turkish government was reported to say, responding to concerns expressed by Washington over the recent internet law, the US is the last state to advise Turkey with respect to the internet. Given that Turkey is undoubtedly one of the most important allies in the Middle East for the US, this situation should not be very good. Regardless of whether you like it or not, the US has been championing the value of freedom of information by which the democracy and innovation is promised to succeed. Unfortunately, this reputation might be currently dented, which could reduce the geopolitical influence of the US to some extent. I sincerely hope it will be recovered very soon. So what is necessary to be done now? In the area of international trade, accumulated wisdom, such as comparative advantage theory, has shown how free trade would grow the net wealth in each country which has committed free trade. I wish we could have a similar type of theory or analysis for free flow of information. And what I wish to see is to sort out all the problems or issues in a way where we can discern what kind of issue should be addressed in the name of internet governance. I do believe my colleagues here are very aware of that, but maybe it's not the case for a global community. So this kind of sorting out process would be very important. So many issues, especially related to contents, could not and should not be addressed in other forums than internet governance. So that kind of discerning process would be very important. Let me stop here. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. The next panelist is, and forgive me if I'm murdering your name, Dr. Jarno Limnell. And he's a cybersecurity director at McAfee.
Thank you very much. First of all, I have to say that it's my pleasure to be here. And I have noticed that everyone has started by talking about weather. I can only say that coming from the Northern Europe, from Finland, this is nothing. But unfortunately, even if I see cybersecurity in a very positive way, I am not very positive at this moment. I left Europe 1.5 weeks ago. I went to the RSA, now here, and this evening back to London. And I have to say that from the security point of view, Europe is in quite a different situation today than it was 1.5 weeks ago because of situation in Ukraine. And I have to say, as an ex-officer and coming from Europe, that the situation doesn't look good. Not at all. And we should be worried about all activities, what is ongoing in the physical reality and also so-called cyberspace. And there are lots of issues ongoing there at this moment. I just read this morning from Reuters and foreign policy coming from the public sources now that Russians are disrupting some of the telecommunications in Crimea area. And I think we should not be so worried, to be honest, about what the Russians are doing there, what the Ukrainians might be doing there, but what the other actors in this same field are probably doing there. Because when we are talking about the cyber, we are talking about the internet governance, we are talking about the cyber crime, and especially when we are talking about the warfare in shadows, cyber war. There aren't so many, as General Alexander stated very well, so many precedents from the past. So each event, what is happening and will happening in the world, the countries, all of them, are following very carefully. And what I am actually a little bit more afraid of is that these other players will mix the reality of the cyber in Ukraine situation to get even worse. And at the same time, it's very interesting to see, are some countries going to outsource their cyber activities to some nationalist proxies or some nationalist groups, or even giving them information, malwares, information about vulnerabilities, even money. And after that say that there is total deniability all the actions what you are doing. And that's very problematic from the international law point of view. We have to understand that whatever is happening nowadays, in a way we are living under cyber dome. Cyber is everywhere. And if you want to be a credible player in the military battlefield today, you have to possess very good cyber capabilities, defense, intelligence, offense. And I wouldn't see like simple disruptions to web pages or mild denial of service attacks to some web pages so harmful. What is ongoing in Russia, in Ukraine, and more or less in all countries in the world at this moment. But when I'm thinking about the situation going forward in Ukraine, I am a little bit afraid that some major disruptions to government services or to critical infrastructure might escalate the crisis to a new level. Hopefully that will not happen. But what is the most important outcome, what we can already make a conclusion out of the Ukraine situation? Because it's very strongly connected to the theme what Mr. Kuhn was just talking, and what we are actually talking when we are talking about the internet governance also. That's about trust. And already what has happened in the Eastern Europe or in the Southern Russia has weakened trust between different players in the international chessboard. And as we very well know, in each level, when trust is lost, it takes time to fix it. Hopefully the things are not going any worse in Ukraine. But I see the same situation when I'm thinking about trust in cyber. Little by little, look at this slide. The zone of trust, the green zone, has been decreasing. A little by little, not only coming from the Snowden revelations, not at all. There are many, many other things affecting here. But little by little, unfortunately, the red zone of distrust has been increasing. And I think that the decisions what are being made within the next few years are very important for the future of the internet and future of the security, not only cybersecurity, but the security also. Are we really going to increase those actions what will increase the trust? Or are we heading even more to this red zone, the zone of distrust? Because how I see it already, this is the greatest innovation during our lifetime, internet. Unbelievable. But this is the current situation, what is ongoing in Europe at this moment. Chancellor Merkel from Germany, President Hollande from France, has been discussing during the last few weeks as one example about the European internet, that all the European data should be stored in Europe, and we should have like our own internet over there. This is ongoing discussion. Fragmentation of internet. And this raises me to ask, I think, the very important question. Are we the last generation to fully enjoy the best things out of the internet? And my answer is very simple. It's no. And hopefully that will not happen. Because we are talking about the trust. And when I'm thinking about my position, our company's Intel Security's position in this question, I think Michael Daniel said it very well in his keynote this morning, emphasizing these two issues. And I fully, and Intel Security, stay behind them. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jarno. Our next speaker is Mr. Jeff Moss, who is the former Chief Security Officer at ICANN and even more famous for his role as founder and director of the Black Hat and DEF CON.
Thank you. So I was looking at the title of this panel, Internet Governance, Foreign Policy, National Security, and the ongoing tension between sovereignty and multi-stakeholder model. And the first three things there, foreign policy, national security, and sovereignty, those are pretty much the domain of the state. Only the last thing there, multi-stakeholder model, do companies and individuals really get a say in. So it sounds like it's kind of stacked against the private sector from the very beginning. And in my internet governance related conversations, both with governments and individuals, I'm always fascinated by how much language informs our thought. And by the words we choose, it naturally leads us down certain paths. So for example, the language of war, cyber war, it's just so natural. It brings you to the place you want to be. Wars generally are won or lost. There's an end state you're trying to achieve. And the language of war is domination, dominance, destruction, boots on the ground, degrade. Those don't sound like civilian words, corporate words. Those sound very governmental and military. But it's the language of sort of the national security state. When you think about the language that the private sector generally uses, it's more of a public safety analogy. And I've been finding this analogy to be really useful when talking to people in other countries who maybe don't have such an imposing military. So for example, doctors don't think that they're going to win the war against cancer. You don't enter the medical profession and say, I'm going to cure cancer. That'd be a pretty unhealthy perspective to hold. You're not going to cure all diseases. It's a constant battle. It's a constant fight. And so generally the language is more like inoculate, treat, build an immunity, identify. And so these are words that sort of work to everybody's benefit. The war analogy is to the benefit of maybe an individual nation or a coalition of nations. The language of public safety is to everybody's benefit on the whole planet. Everybody can benefit from an inoculation. And so my concern has been growing over how much offense has seemed to overwhelm defense. The debate used to be, is cyber a fifth domain in the national security space? Is it a fifth domain? Or is it like pixie dust that's sprinkled over the other 4 domains, air, land, sea, and space? And in the US, we decided that no, it's a fifth domain. It's sprinkled over all the 4 in Cyber Command, but it's really a separate pillar, fifth domain. And so my concern there is that when you fight a battle in land, air, sea, or space, and you're done with that battle, you can sort of go home. The boat sinks, the satellite crashes, the airplane blows up, whatever. Those are intrinsic natural forces. The internet is completely man-made. When you fight a battle in this fifth domain, the internet is going to change underneath your feet. The sand's going to change under you. And it's going to reform in a way that's unpredictable. For example, if I'm running a large piece of the internet backbone and you start having a fight on my territory, I get to change the rules on you, right? I don't have to sit there and watch you 2 sides fight. I can just terminate your peering agreements. And my concern is that the internet of the future is going to be different than the internet of today because we're going to have a couple of fights. The internet's going to change permanently, and the internet for our children is going to be different. And we have to be really cognizant of that if we want to lock in some of these benefits to competition and innovation. So when you talk about internet governance, I find it means different things to different communities. In the government sphere, it's a lot of confidence building measures and discussions about, the double illegal. What's illegal in your country that's also illegal in my country? Let's come to some sort of agreement in that. But when you talk to corporations, corporations don't have armies and they don't have state departments. What they do have is they have lawyers and contracts. Right? That's the world that the rest of us live in that don't happen to be a nation state. And in that world, our language is about acceptable use policies, peering agreements, service level agreements. And like I talked about earlier, we can take private action. And it's always fascinating to watch the operators of some of the backbone respond. There was a giant attack, Spam House was previously the largest known denial of service attack, 300 gigabits. Just recently, there was a 400 gigabit attack against Cloudflare. We didn't need permission from the governments to respond. Nobody called the UN or ITU. The service operators prevented the attack, mitigated it, and solved it. No government necessary, through private agreements. And so I think this is the inherent tension between safety and national security needs of government and what the multi-stakeholder model can currently deliver. I view those private solutions as a multi-stakeholder solution. But what governments and national security people are asking for, I think, is another level of certainty. And I have one example I want to bring up. It's the example of source address validation. I'm sorry if I'm going to throw some technical words around here, but there's this idea that the vast majority of denial of service attacks that happen today are done by spoofed traffic. You might have heard this. So the solution for spoofed traffic prevention is over 20 years old. There's best practices, BCP 38, BCP 84, so on and so forth. And what they do is they have a very simple way of preventing these denial of service attacks that are generated through source address spoofing. But there's a problem. For me to get the benefit of a protection against source address spoofing, you have to take an action. So it's sort of a tragedy of the commons issue. I make costly changes to my network, and now my network can't be used to attack you. But your network can still be used to attack me unless you make changes. Currently, very, very few companies make these changes. No governments have mandated that source address spoofing needs to be limited. Telecom in Russia is the first ISP that I know of that has mandated this for their own customers. So it's this tragedy of the commons problem where we have a shared resource, but other individuals have to take the cost for the others to get a burden. It's sort of like an immunity problem. Enough of the population needs to be inoculated for the rest of us to get a benefit. This problem has been known for 20 years, and it hasn't been addressed by governments, and it hasn't been addressed by the multi-stakeholder system. And I think problems like these not being addressed are very visible to companies because companies are going out of business by these attacks, and it's very visible to countries. And so I think we as a community can really learn a lot if we can study why are problems such as the BCP38 problem, why are we not solving these problems? It's not going away. It's been a challenge for 20 years. It'll be a challenge for the next 20 years. It's a very simple solution. But if we can't as a community even solve this problem, I think everything else we're talking about is very aspirational when we can't even solve a basic technical problem. And so that's my view. Thank you.
Very good, Jeff. Well, this panel has been extremely respectful of their time limits, and so we have a full half hour now for questions and discussion from the audience. I might make a few overview comments. Just to remind you, Paul Brigner spoke about developing principles for internet governance. Someone might want to ask him, why do we need principles? What do they do? Why is the Brazilian government asking for principles at that gum fig? Mr. Kume talked about trust, and the reason he thinks that the Japanese have not lost trust in the U.S. government were rather interesting, and an interesting contrast with actually with Jeff Moss's talk, in which he's talking about sort of military rhetoric versus private sector or internet-related rhetoric. In the private sector, we try to solve problems through technical and sort of contractual and associational means, whereas apparently the military is trying to solve them through brute force. And that's an interesting clash of cultures there that really plays a big role in the internet governance battles. And that leads us to Jarno's talk, in which he spoke about an area that's happening right now where we do have a military conflict, and he sees these kinds of conflicts as very much related to rather than separate from the cyber conflicts, and claims that the zone of trust is progressively decreasing. So I think we have some very well-informed and very interesting but also contrasting perspectives on this panel. So if you're not going to ask a question, is there? Yes, Mr. Kong.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. Let me ask about the representation. To me, I'm not deeply understood of the kind of information about multi-stakeholder approach at the ICANN board of members, board of director members. Is there any other issues kind of the less representation issue? Because Korea is one of the most kind of internet deeply penetrating country. So we want to more involved in those kind of the governance issues regarding internet operation, and of course, IETF as well. So do you have any kind of, because I do not have any information about the new proposal, actually Professor Miller said and Bregner you said. So if you have any kind of, revised version of those kind of presentation issue, it will be great. Thank you.
Your question was that the Korean, you're from the Korean government, right? Because I know that there's a very lively culture of internet multi-stakeholderism in Korea right now. And I know that there are some tensions between the Korean government sometimes and the internet community, the local internet community, about some of the issues. So for example, when the Korean government established control over the country code, some people thought that was a good idea, some people resisted that. And I think that's a good example of how these issues are playing out on the global scale. Anyway, I'd be happy to give you a copy of this paper, and actually I'd like to discuss it with you because I just learned that you were in my policy class about 10 years ago.
Likewise, I'd be happy to share information that I have with you about these proposals that I mentioned as well.
Hi, Mike Best again, and I promise this time it'll be an easy question. Mr. Moss, you made the comparison to inoculating systems, and I think that's a very apt metaphor, and you talked about corporations being able to respond to cyber attacks without having to involve any governments or NGOs or anything like that. Do you think that that still holds true when a cyber attack is committed by a private organization like the Russian business network that has various levels of state sponsorship from countries like Russia and Iran and North Korea? Do you think that at that point the corporations need to involve the government to some level? And if not, do you think that they should?
So good question, and I want to dodge this one a little bit by saying it's up to the individual business's needs. So for example, I know sometimes the last thing you want to do is involve the FBI.
Yeah.
Because once you do that, it's out of your hands, it's on its own right track. The civil action, civil recourse is sort of out of your hands. In other regards, you might be required to by law to inform them. I mean, there might be crimes that rise to such a level that you have to notify the FBI, you have to involve them. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, theft of intellectual property. You have to decide, is it the company's job to go pursue criminals in Russia, or is it to minimize the loss and get back to the market and try to innovate so quickly that it doesn't matter that some of their property was stolen because they're going to be 3 generations down the road before the people who stole the information bring it to market. So it's a very complicated decision when you involve government, when you don't. Maybe you pursue the civil and at the last minute you bring in the law enforcement.
As a quick follow-up, earlier I think it was the general who commented that the press doesn't have access to both classified and declassified information. They can't decide what needs to be released and what's in the national interest. Do you think that the same might apply to corporations when they are attacked by a group like RBN, that they may not have the proper context to decide, well, this is part of a larger attack?
Right. And so you see a lot of companies participate in what are called private trust networks, or private trust groups. And that's generally companies, almost like an FS-ISAC or an ISAC's information sharing arrangement, where companies, experts, are constantly talking about what the threats they are that they're seeing. It's all done sort of under an NDA. And then that's how they can leverage, sort of business intelligence. But again, that doesn't require the government.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask 2 questions, but I'll ask one. This is my name is Samira Daniels with Ramsey Decisions, and this is for Mr. Limnell, is it? I was interested in your characterization and explanation of the potential for a European internet. And I'm wondering whether this has reflected an undercurrent of, sort of suspicion of Europe that has preceded, these recent revelations of, Angela Merkel's phone and all that. I mean, I wasn't quite clear as to, what the precise nature of taking such a step was. And just quickly for Mr. Moss, don't you think that the surveillance paradigm has, as being the overarching paradigm and the knowledge paradigm is subsumed to it, that this balance is just never going to be equalized in a way that allows the knowledge paradigm to sort of take its central. I mean, it's where it should be. So either one.
Thank you very much for a good question. I have the privilege, because of my job, to have cyber discussions in the different parts of the world. Well, that's not privilege if you ask my wife. But if I would have to describe with one word what is ongoing in cyber in the whole world at this moment, I would say suspicion. Suspicion. And sorry, my examples are only very often military orientated, but I think one of the best examples comes from the NATO. At this moment, by my experience, when we are talking about sharing capabilities, knowledge, whatever, in the physical reality, all the NATO members are saying that yes, this is a good thing. But when we start talking about cyber capabilities, usually the mouths of the generals are closed because they don't know what the others have and they don't know how we should deal with this problem. And it same goes with the Angela Merkel's, as my opinion, speeches on the European internet. There is a suspicion and confusion also that how these problems should be solved. Can we trust you? Once again, we come to the trust theme. And of course, as always, there's a lot of politics in these speeches and political rhetorics. And I wouldn't forget when we talk about the internet governance and the future of it, and when I'm thinking especially in the context of suspicion, about the problematic concerning about the cyber arms control. Because that is, I think, one of the most important issues creating the suspicion in the world at this moment. Because the governments are putting more and more money, even if they are decreasing defense budgets, for example, Western world, like the United States, probably in your today relieved the state's budget, the military budget is the smallest since the Second World War, but there are some growth areas, especially cyber. And that's more or less the same situation in every Western country nowadays. So we are putting more and more money, increasing the suspicion, and then to talking about shared knowledge, openness, democracy, very nice principles. It's pretty hard to create them in the context of internet governance.
So on your question about the surveillance paradigm, I think the one healthy thing that has happened from all these revelations is that it's actually activated the internet standards bodies. So you see the Internet Engineering Task Force has started to have meetings trying to determine what are defenses to pervasive monitoring. And they're, if you look at what they're thinking of doing with HTTP 2.0, it's always encrypted all the time, everything. And so it's kind of gone from that's something the paranoid people talk about to if this is the reality we live in, how are we going to engineer around it? And so you see some really healthy engineering conversations occurring right now. And it's also moved the debate, I think, to a more healthy place, at least from my perspective, in corporations. So before it was very perimeter focused, right? We keep them all out. And the problem with that is the only people that are busy keeping them out is like the IT department and the security department. And then we have a team for that. The company goes about its business. But now if the paradigm is they're inside, right? The attack, you have to assume they're inside. This loss of trust, you just have to assume they're inside. Well, if that's the assumption now I get to have a conversation with my legal department, my financial department. I have to talk with security team, communications. Do I tell the world I've been compromised or not? What do I do with my PR team? Now all of a sudden I have a healthy internal debate between all my company departments discussing what to do, where before it was like the IT department out in the corner. And so I think a perverse side effect of all these revelations is it's allowed the IETF to progress technically to make things more pervasively secure. And what we're trying to get at is rise the costs of bulk collection and force them to focus individually more with traditional law enforcement means. And then it's also moved into a more healthy discussion about companies' risks. So all is not lost, but it's a steep climb.
I'd like to interject here. I think a very profound, following up on your question. So we have this optimistic view from you, Jeff, about the private sector and the internet being able to take care of its own problems and multi-stakeholderism. And we have a very pessimistic view from Jarno about cyber war, cyber arms control. The question is, how do those two things interact? For example, is multi-stakeholder governance sustainable in a period where governments are pouring more money into cyber weapons and viewing cybersecurity as an element of national power? How far do we let this go? Is this a problem for internet governance to solve? And so there's an irony here. Is there anybody in the House, everybody on the panel says they're for multi-stakeholderism. Is there anybody here who is not? Can you raise your hand? There's a hand. There's one hand there. Okay. So we have like 1 out of 100 people that says they're not against, that they're not for multi-stakeholder governance. But on the other hand, we have very powerful trends that really work against it. So I think we need to take that into account. Sorry for that.
Steve McFadden from Bethesda. If I send packets around my house, they all start in IPv4 with 192.168, and if any of them get on the internet, they fall on the floor and they don't get routed. With IPv6, we could put a bit which says this packet isn't to go outside the local nation. The counter-argument is that this might lead to the balkanization of the internet. Now, having a national bit on the IPv6 and so forth, would this be a good thing? Would this be a bad thing? Would this be a necessary thing because governments would want it? Or would it be ineffective because it wouldn't be respected and there's too many bypasses?
I think your last point there is the crux of the problem, is routing changes so dynamically, so quickly. It's like route filtering. It's very intensive to change route filtering. And this is why sometimes you see traffic leak from, say, China, and it starts absorbing traffic from, say, Facebook. There's a route leak. Humans will make mistakes, and so I think, first off, bad thing to balkanize the internet. Second thing, technically I think it would be very difficult because so many connections are being added and dropped all the time that you'd be spending all of your time trying to figure out if the bit is flipped or not, or was that the Russian bit, or was that the private bit, or was that China's bit, or why is the China bit coming through Russia? In the end, what's the benefit you're trying to achieve by balkanizing? And no disrespect to the Balkans. No.
I have a perspective on that also. Just quickly, can you actually fragment the internet? Is it even possible? I mean, the people in security that I know about talk about how difficult it is, even with an air gap, to stay disconnected. I'm wondering if we want to talk about this in a different way. It's not actual fragmentation or so-called balkanization, but rather gatekeepers, the establishment of gatekeepers that impose policy requirements on traffic, and that gets back to your permissionless innovation principle. Mm-hmm. And you had something to say. Go ahead.
Well, we can't forget that the internet is physical infrastructure, so it might be very difficult to balkanize the internet, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's not possible based on that physical layer of the internet. But speaking to the comment earlier, so the Internet Engineering Task Force is meeting in London today and this week, and they are accepting all requests for comments about IPv6 and other topics. So I would suggest that they're completely open and transparent. So if any of you have any ideas for what might be done there, that's the place to take it.
Okay, now we have the last person on earth who's not in favor of multi-stakeholderism at the microphone.
My name is John Savage. I'm from Brown University. I think the multi-stakeholder model, I think I should clarify my position. I feel like the little child who says, the emperor has no clothes. The multi-stakeholder model has obviously been extraordinarily successful. And what it's done is it's given engineers and others an opportunity to come collectively together to solve problems that better than I think government could solve them. What worries me is that going forward, there are going to be disputes having to do with governance. And right now, there is no role for governments that they have worked out with the multi-stakeholder community to safeguard the multi-stakeholder model of standard setting and rule making. And there's a Judge Abe Sofair that some of you may know. He was a legal advisor in the State Department to Secretary of State Schultz. He shares this view. There are a few others who do as well, that there are pitfalls here and that we should be concerned about them and find ways of addressing them. I'd like your views on the subject.
Hello, Suresh Krishnaswamy. So one of the themes that we've been talking about is about trust in the internet and how that is changing. And at the same time, the technical community has a number of initiatives for establishing and building trust in the internet. So there's things for the routing infrastructure, there's things for the DNS, there's various other things that are being built, developed. But one of the things that's a problem with deploying these technologies is a collective action problem where people don't want to simultaneously deploy something because it would mean a harm to them at first, but then there is benefits at some later point. So my question is, do you see the deployment of these internet infrastructure security mechanisms to be a market-driven thing, or is there a role that government ought to play in deploying these technologies?
I'll take that one. I wish I could say it was market-driven, but it's not, in my perspective. That's why it was shocking to see or to hear that Rus Telecom has implemented BCP 38. I think one other country, a fairly small country, has implemented it in their telecom infrastructure. And they're predominantly doing that to help law enforcement trace the source of spoof traffic. And so I've come to the conclusion I don't like it, but I have to be realistic with myself that I believe regulation is going to be the forcing function here. Through sort of a public safety analogy, you might not like it, but you need to take your medicine for the benefit of all of us. And I wish there was an insurance pressure or a market force that was doing this, but I think it might be the power of the purse from the federal government in procurement regulations saying, we'll give, like, for example, DNSSEC adoption in the US government happened largely because that was in a procurement regulation. Same thing's happening now with IPv6. If you want to sell to the government, you need to support v6. And I think it's going to be through these sorts of initiatives that you can force maybe the market. If it's a requirement, Microsoft will do it. If Microsoft does it, it's feature parity with Apple, right? And Google has to respond. And so there's maybe leverage points, but the market doesn't seem to be dealing with security by itself.
I could add to that a little bit. I think maybe the different technology issues could have different impetus for pushing them along. So IPv6 obviously has, there's very good rationale for companies to adopt that, given the pool of IPv4 addresses dwindling. So it gets to a point when I think companies can, as a collective, realize the need to move forward, and the Internet Society has played a pretty important role with regard to IPv6 in bringing the Internet technical community together and trying to push them together as a group to adopt IPv6, for example. And we've seen good success there, and I suspect we'll be taking on other issues, maybe like BCP 38 possibly, to push that along as well.
Just to add something, security can be both a public good and a private good. You invest in locks in your doors and alarms on your car. That's a private protection. And then there's the police protection, which is treated as a public good. Now, and the last panel was talking about national cybersecurity policies, and I always wonder when I hear about those whether they're treating it as a private good, that is the government securing its own networks, which frankly, many of them have done a very, very bad job of. So you have agencies that have incredibly leaky security and terrible practices regulating the rest of the private sector and telling them how to make their systems more secure. There's a certain irony in that. This is not to say that it is theoretically impossible for the government to pass the right kinds of standards or laws or regulations that would actually have the public good aspect of cybersecurity. But one has to also be a little bit skeptical about what kind of decisions they would make. Would they force you to acquire technologies that will be obsolete in 2 years? Will they focus on this thing when the real action is over here? So take it with a grain of salt. I wouldn't say paralyze government, don't let them do anything, but be very careful about how you're achieving public security and make sure that they have their own act together first.
Thank you.
Hi, Eric Berger. I'm a professor here. Paul, I miss you in London because getting up at 4 in the morning and someone who can't hold the camera straight, you can hold the camera straight. Yes, I'm also a trustee of the Internet Society, and I was a trustee of the IETF. And actually, that's what I'd like to actually bring up, and it hits on the title here about tension between sovereignty and multi-stakeholderism. Let's say the IETF does do PERS pass, the opportunistic encryption. For lots of reasons, service providers from commercial perspectives will not want to have that happen. And in fact, if you look at a lot of regulations, even in the United States, it's kind of very hard to do that. There'd be a conflict that there are some regulations that say, for example, you must record everything if you're a financial services institution. So I think that I'd like to hear from everybody on the panel. This is now a real tension. The multi-stakeholder, and actually from a question I heard before, multi-stakeholder doesn't mean multi-countries. In fact, if anything, it means everybody but the governments. Although we do let the governments come in every now and then. How do you think you can see a way forward for resolutions of these kinds of tensions? I could give you an easy question. Paul, I'm trying to decide whether we keep paying your salary.
Yeah, I better jump in on this one then, huh? Well, I think we've seen as the technologies are adopted, the regulations have had to adapt, or the principles adapt to support them if they're deemed important. So I think that that's kind of the beauty of the internet, is that these things can be voluntarily adopted, and there is the permissionless innovation model. And so when these things start to gain traction, sometimes they can grow very quickly, and then there can be the realization that it is an important new technology or new principle that needs to be adopted.
Yeah, with regard to multi-stakeholder model, the value of the internet is created by the virtue of interoperability, openness, innovation, free flow of information, and operational stability. Although multi-stakeholder model may not be necessarily valuable in itself, but in order to achieve these values, so far the existing multi-stakeholder model seems to work well. So, and in this model, the government involvement is not excluded. So that to the extent capable, they can participate. But in reality, it doesn't work well according to our experiences. That's my view.
Very shortly, two issues what I have been seeing lately and what makes me a little bit worried. One, first of all, I think we will see in a way, unfortunately, I hope that not. But what seems to be happening is that there is like a creating new kind of new regions in the world, meaning that there are like new alliances, new regions within some nations, some countries are creating their own shared legislations and their standards. And that might be a little bit different than European Union or North America or Africa. There might be like a new alliances because of these standards and legislation shared with internet and cyber. The other issue is that in some countries already, governments are compelling private companies to put the cybersecurity in the certain level. And I think that's by legislation. And as my opinion, I think that is dangerous policy. Because more or less after that, pretty often, what the company does, it just raises the security to this level what is said in the legislation. And everybody else know it also. That the fence will be this high, and if you want to get in, you just have to go a little bit higher. So in a way, when this is like a wild, wild west, that you don't know what the others have and how strong or weak defenses the others have, it has its advantages also.
Okay, we have 2 more minutes, so room for one more question, I hope.
Lynn Wheeler, consultant. When I originally took the issue about filtering to the ISPs 20 years ago, I wound up peeling through a whole bunch of excuses why they didn't do it. At that time, the core excuse was that if they did it and anything leaked through, they would be held liable for the ones that leaked through, and so there was no upside to their effort. Now, the counter was I was involved in the original data breach notification legislation in California, and the issue there was similar to the argument that normally an institution takes security countermeasures to protect itself. In the data breach case, the institutions weren't at risk, it was the public at risk. So in the ISP case, there was an argument that they weren't at risk, it was somebody else at risk. But in fact, peeling that through, even a much more core issue was that they felt that they might be subject to liability if something happened when they were trying to filter and it leaked through. So there was a liability issue that I don't see anybody trying to address.
Right, well, it's kind of not something to bring up with 1 minute left, the liability issue. I'm not sure we can handle that in 30 seconds. Maybe Paul can.
I wouldn't try to do that.
I would say there's a similar issue there with the this BCP 38 issue. It's like you talk to ISPs and you say that you're in a position to filter this. It's a great spot. You know what the addresses are. You should filter. And they say, no, we shouldn't filter. It should be the customer premise equipment, that router at home. It should be filtered at the edge. You say, okay, well, there's maybe 10, 20 manufacturers in the world. That's a sizable problem. We just go to these 20 manufacturers and get them to make this change. You go to them and they say, no, it shouldn't be us. It should be the ISPs. And so the two places where it's the most economical to filter, neither one wants to do it. And I don't think governments are going to let that happen for very long if attacks keep occurring. And so we'll see whose argument wins.
All right, so anybody interested in this paper on globalizing IANA? I've got a few copies up here, and I'll turn it back over to Catherine.
I'm going to take one of those copies from you, Milton. Well, thank you, Milton, and I want to thank the rest of your panelists.